morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Welcome. Today, we're diving deep into the world of hydrogen tech with Alex Zorniger from Power to Hydrogen, the man behind some of the most cutting edge hydrogen projects out there. But here's the kicker: he's not just pioneering technology, he's mastering the art of snagging those crucial dollars from the Department of Energy to fuel those innovations. How does one navigate the labyrinth of government funding to push the boundaries of clean energy? That's what we are here for to uncover. Alex, welcome.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me.
Before we start, please remember to leave a comment with your questions. Send a direct message or email us at info@energynews.biz. We are here for you today. We will continue after the short break.
NextAI Booster is a scale-up program that helps early-stage, most promising startups focusing on green hydrogen scale their solution at industrial level.
Power to Hydrogen is one of the first startups that we collaborate with out of the NextAI Booster program.
We make electrolyzers that can produce green hydrogen. What it does is it just takes water and electricity and it makes hydrogen. Our technology is specifically designed to pair well with renewable energy and do it better.
This is a great example of a collaboration with the startups that had a great idea, had a proof of concept already, like on a small scale.
The next step is to scale it up and build a bigger version that can go out to renewable sites and plug in to the renewable energy and generate hydrogen there.
This is what I see as opportunity within NextAI Booster program. You have the chance to really validate the technology with experts, with NL and with scientific partners. We can always give them the expertise that we have.
Be involved in a project like this and seeing that this will be a reality and be part of this is completely something amazing.
Collaborating at this level is also exciting because this company is doing something very new. The only way is to have big collaboration, the only way to make real innovation.
We know that we cannot do this alone, and that's the whole concept of the open innovability. We want to be part of it because we know it's bigger than everybody.
We are always pursuing innovation, so it has to be done together.
Alex, how do you pitch hydrogen projects to DOE? Is it like a Shark Tank?
Yeah, so the process with most Department of Energy grants is it's mostly written. So it will be a pretty extensive proposal at the end, but the way it kind of is structured and the way it moves forward is typically there is an RFI from the Department of Energy, so a request for information. So they will solicit feedback from industry, try to understand what the needs are from different companies, as well as matching that with their different research needs. After the RFI, after they've collected the information, it typically goes to a notice of intent. And so you can find basically, if you subscribe to some of the DOE's newsletters and the specific offices, you can find the announcements of all these different things. But so the notice of intent is there's going to be 2 months from now, we are going to issue a funding opportunity. And so that's called a funding opportunity announcement, so a FOA. So the FOA is the real announcement where they give all the details of exactly what they want to fund. And so once the FOA is issued, typically there is a concept paper stage. So the concept paper stage is not very long. So it's usually like somewhere around a 3 or 4 page document where you're supposed to hit the summaries of each different point. So there will be summaries that you have to write for things like, what is the problem you're solving? What is the value proposition? Who is the team that you're putting together? Where is the site work going on? What resources do you have? So that's a fairly easy, kind of like a half-day process to actually put together, although there's a lot of work that goes into it behind the scenes as far as putting that teaming partner list of who you're going to work with if it's not just your organization. And so once you submit the concept paper, they might take 2 to 4 weeks to review it. Typically, that's kind of a rough schedule. And if your concept paper is encouraged for submission, Then you have to do the long drawn out, not drawn out necessarily, but very detailed proposal that typically with all the appendix documents can be between 50 and 100 pages. So when we pitch a grant to DOE or a project, typically this is mainly through written form. Depending upon the office, some of the offices will, once they've reviewed your proposal, maybe there are questions that come up, so there can be an interview session. But with the DOE, most of it is pitching your project through a written project proposal.
So was there feedback during the process?
Yeah, so sometimes they'll ask about specific partners. The DOE is really focused on who you're partnering with, where their funding is coming from. So sometimes there'll be more tactical questions about who you're partnering with and where their resources come from. Other times they will be clarifying things. So whether it's you have to meet certain requirements to be eligible for the grant, they'll ask about that. There can be clarifications. The larger the funding amount that you are applying for, typically the more extensive the in-person or video interviews are. So if you're applying for something very large, like a loan program's office loan, which can be $100 million plus, there will be a lot longer interview stage. Whereas if you're applying for something quite small, like one of the smallest DOE grants is the SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Program. They're typically around $200,000 for the first phase. Typically, there is no interview process for those, so they kind of put more effort into and more personnel time. The larger the grant is, so it can vary based on the size that you apply for.
What key elements make a grant proposal successful?
I think one of the most important ones is the team that's submitting. So what we've found is we have been in the DOE system working on DOE grants for over 5 years. And so we have a long track record of success with the DOE and delivering on the funding that they deliver. And so one of the ways the DOE looks at this funding is they want to minimize risk for the amount of funding that they give out. And one of the ways that they can do that is work with partners that have already successfully delivered projects and who have relationships within the organization, within Department of Energy. So having people that know you, having an organization that's successfully delivered on your projects, or if you don't have that, finding a creative way to leverage other entities and other teams that do have a relationship with the DOE, I think is a really important piece to it. Innovation is always important. Having technology that has a really strong value proposition, but also IP behind it. Because if you have promise a strong value proposition, but don't have IP behind it, what is the real potential innovation there or protectability for your company? I think resources to deliver on what you say you're going to deliver, and that kind of what resources you need to be able to deliver on a grant kind of scales with the size that you're applying for. So if you're applying for a $200,000 SBIR, your resources don't need to be extensive, but you need to have some sort of facilities and lab equipment or plan to maybe leverage a university's equipment. Whereas if you're applying for maybe one of the new offices is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And so typically they're funding $10 to $100 million installations of technology. So having the facilities to be able to manufacture technology at that scale, essentially all of the proposal process is proving to the DOE that you have something interesting, innovative, and you have a team and the resources to execute it so that they can de-risk and feel more comfortable about the funding that they give to you. So teaming partner, having the right resources, and then really looking at what the application's asking for. So I think probably the two most important things are the relationships you have and looking at the FOA critically, the funding opportunity announcement, and making sure that your technology is a really close fit to what they're asking for. I think some of the proposals in the past that we have not won, most of it has been because we don't have the clearest fit for the problem that they want solved. And so I think one of the greatest skills or priorities is to make sure, save your time and really only apply to the ones you think you're a really great fit for.
You mentioned relationships. How meaningful are relationships in securing and maintaining funding from DOE, and how do you build those effectively?
Yeah, I think it's really important, as I mentioned. I think we have like an interesting maybe story to tell because we've been really successful at the DOE, but we have not been able to get a consistent funding cadence with the Department of Defense. And I think a lot of that is probably because of our relationships and our partners and things like that. Fortunately, we've been able to get a good amount of funding from the DOE, so we haven't had to focus as much on Department of Defense funding. But I think it provides an interesting story where the origin of our company is a good example. So our CEO, Paul Matter, who was on that video before, so he was working for an organization that was DOE funded in the past. The name was Nexeris or Nextech Materials. They've rebranded in the past. I think they're Nexeris now. But so they were winning DOE grants, both SBIR grants and different grants, back in like 2005. And that's when Paul was on the team. And so Paul, in his role, he's a PhD scientist. So he was writing the grants. He kind of learned what type of form you need to write the proposal in. And then he also was delivering on the grants. So once they would win the grants, he would write the reports and things like that. So he knew how to deliver on those reports. So at a certain point in time, Paul decided to go out on his own. One of the reasons was because he already had relationships with certain Department of Energy officials where they knew him, they knew that he could deliver on some of these projects, even if he was with a new entity. So I think that's a really good example. So Paul went out on his own. He had some relationships, but also because speaking to that legitimacy and ability to deliver on some of these projects, with a new startup company and no venture-backed funding at that time, he needed to leverage different resources for, do we have the facilities and the equipment to deliver on this? So one thing that he did was he partnered with Ohio State University, which is where we are in Columbus, Ohio, to be able to leverage some of their faculty that also had relationships with the Department of Energy, but also their equipment and facilities. So I think it was a really good example where Paul had personal relationships at the Department of Energy, but his new entity, which at that time was PH Matter, really didn't have a track record. And so he leveraged Ohio State University, which has a long track record of success with the Department of Energy. So I think that's a good example of both having the relationships, but then leveraging additional relationships if you're a newer entity. But speaking towards kind of the things we're doing now, we've evolved from some of the more fundamental R&D proposals to applying for proposals to scale up, component manufacturing, scale up the actual production of electrolyzers. At this stage, you need to pull in a lot different partners. And so again, it all goes back to that de-risking piece where now what we're doing, like we recently applied for some funding to be able to build a manufacturing facility. So we're working with an EPC contractor that has built fuel cell and electrolyzer manufacturing facilities in the past. So if you're going for new tranches of funding that you have never delivered on, think about who has delivered on that type of funding before and try to figure out a way to bring them into your proposal. Sometimes with those entities, it can be very easy where you apply for $1 million or 200,000 or whatever the number is, or 10 million. And you can just write them into the grant proposal and they are able to get the funding through that. And that's a really good win-win for them. But also there can be a piece that can be more challenging, which is the cost share component. So cost share is typically the DOE on many grants will want some of the funding to come from private sources. So that can be revenue for your company, that can be venture capital investors, or it can be through different resources where you just, as an entity and you have cash reserves, you basically pay for some of your employees to fund the project. So you can get some of these larger entities into your grant proposal and say, I'll give you funding. They love that. But sometimes they're a little bit more sensitive about bringing cost share to the proposal unless it's really aligned with what they do. For instance, we applied to get some funding for a large manufacturing facility. The EPC that we're working with, if they do this project, they don't necessarily, this is one EPC project for them. That's their core business line. So they're not going to donate any cost share to the project. So we've had to raise more private capital to be able to pay for their cost share as well. Whereas if you have a separate topic, maybe more on the R&D side, so we've done some joint development projects where we have an RPE project right now. And so that's to do very high pressure electrolysis. So we are doing all of the stack design, and then we have a high pressure vessel maker doing the vessel design. And because we're both doing development together and they can use some of that development in the future for future product lines, they've been much more willing to give cost share to the project. So leveraging partners is critical, but understanding how they're going to think about cost share for this specific project, I think is an important piece to getting them onto your proposal.
Once you secure the funding, how does Power to Hydrogen leverage these funds to maximize project outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, the funding is amazing, right? So depending upon what you're doing, you would either have to raise private capital as a young company or, win this grant funding. So it's critical for us to go from, the technology that we're commercializing right now started on Department of Energy SBIR project. So initially $200,000. We won a phase 2, which gave us $1 million to pursue it further. That allowed us to develop and apply for the patent applications that we won. And then most recently, we've won a new award to be able to, so it's $6.5 million to be able to scale all the components that go into these innovative electrolyzers to gigawatt scale. And so it's been super valuable along the way. One of the things that I would say is that it's really important, kind of going back to pick the grants that are your best fit. You may be able to win a grant that's kind of outside of your purview or core technology, but what is the end goal for that? Even if you win that project, it's going to turn into separate development that might not be on your product roadmap. And so I think having discipline for what you apply for is really critical, because if you just are sending out applications to a lot of proposals, maybe you even win some and you get funding, which is great. But the end goal of developing a commercializable product, if these new grant opportunities are pulling you off of your product roadmap, maybe that's great for a pivot for the organization, but there's a lot of opportunities out there. And so taking on too many opportunities can really dilute your go-to-market strategy, cause lack of focus in the organization, cause a stretch on resources because you have 3 development projects instead of 1 and you're a small entity. So I think that's a key piece for leveraging the grant funding, but also making it work for your company to grow and scale.
Could you share some insider tips on navigating the funding landscape?
Yeah, so I talked before about kind of the process for how their process for how they identify what grant opportunities they want to list, and then also kind of what their process is for accepting proposals. Some of the other things for navigating the DOE, there are a lot of different offices. So we work a lot with the Office of Electrical Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE. I don't think I got that right. But so there are probably 10 or 15 different offices under the DOE. So I think the first thing is you should take a half day to go to the Department of Energy website and research through it and understand where your technology fits the best. And then key is to sign up for all of those newsletters. So those will keep you apprised of new developments coming out, new funding opportunities. They do a nice job with distributing everything through their newsletters. So I think that's a really key piece. You need to dedicate some time to figuring out where your technology fits best to the DOE. Another good resource that we found really helpful and a really good summary, if you've ever heard of CVTC, which is CTVC, Climate Tech Venture Capital, so it's a website. They have a really nice, I think it's called a Founder's Guide to the DOE. So it will discuss that notice of intent, FOA concept paper process. It will also discuss a lot of the different entities and give you an overview guide of the Department of Energy. And then it will kind of discuss the different offices. So I talked a little bit about it. So typically the SBIR program is for early stage research. There's also some different programs, but then you move on. The DOE has done a really nice job over the last probably 5 years or so in filling the funding gaps along some of these companies' journeys. And so you now have the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. So SBIR develop fundamental technology. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations is going to support deployments of innovative technology when it's too risky for different commercial entities. So that's a really great opportunity for higher TRL technology. For the hydrogen industry specifically, we just had a very large funding opportunity that's more kind of unique and bespoke, where part of the BIL project or the BIL funding that came through in the US was a one-time, very large hydrogen research and development bill. So this was kind of later stage than the SBIR project, but still not deploying new technology typically for most of the projects. So it was the $750 million for the hydrogen research and development as part of the Research and Development and Deployment Office. So that's been really good funding. And then once you get past kind of the development and then the also initial demonstrations of the technology, that's where typically the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office comes into play. Typically, they're offering guaranteed loans. So you still have to pay back the money. It can be guaranteed if there's a challenge with your company. There's lots of different terms in there, but those loans are typically for $100 million and up projects. So there's lots of different offices to get familiar with. The Climate Tech Venture Capital Company or a website, the DOE Founders Guide to the Department of Energy has a really nice overview of some of those offices and the opportunities based on the TRL of your technology.
So I'm starting to think, like, how many people do you need to, do this application?
It's a good question. I think in the past, we've been able to do applications like before I even joined the team at Power to Hydrogen, Paul was able to do these applications mostly by himself. So it certainly takes a long time. I think one of the rules of thumb is a smaller grant proposal can take at least 40 hours of actual work, sometimes 40 to 80 hours. So if you're a small startup, oftentimes there's not a lot that you're developing your technology, but what else you don't really have customers yet. You don't have a ton of employees yet. So you can kind of sometimes pour 40 to 80 hours in to be able to get these proposals done. Certainly, as you get to larger, more complex projects where it's not just research and development and interesting technology, you definitely have to bring in different players. So now when we write grant proposals, I do all the commercial side for the project. Paul or some of our different technical staff will write some of the research plans and the fundamental basics of the IP approach. Then you'll bring in project partners to sometimes write some of the other their sections of the proposal. So definitely for some of the smaller proposals, it's a lot of work, but it is doable by one person. But you're going to really have to be grinding on and finding some focus time. For the larger projects, you certainly start to need teams to be able to put together financial models and construction analyses and things like that. So fortunately, it's always a lot of work, but it's kind of right size for the amount of money that you're going after.
So knowing that you're going to invest so much hours and potentially that you have to invest into the team, is there any feedback through the stages that you're on the good way, let's say?
There's not a ton. So typically, the concept paper is really the only opportunity to not put in a ton of effort. There are concept papers for most programs, so that's a huge benefit. Where again, it's a 3 or 4 page paper to say, this is interesting to us. I think I've read somewhere that 30 to 40% of applications make it through the concept paper phase. So there is a decent sized filter for things that really aren't in scope and don't have a chance of really winning the proposal. I think I could be wrong here, but the SBIR proposal, some of the smaller ones, doesn't have a concept paper phase, but most applications do today have a concept paper phase. But once you've submitted the concept paper and gotten the green light to be able to go to the next stage, really you've got to do all the work, and there might be some questions and interviews along the way, but you don't have any other midterm point between putting in all the work to get the 50 to 75 page document done. Sometimes I look at it like an expected value calculation. So you never know exactly what percentage people will win, but maybe I would say 10% is a realistic if 30 to 40% of people make the concept paper. So how much is the funding worth? Say, maybe aggressively you have a 20% chance to win, but maybe it's a 10% chance to win. So if it's $1 million grant, the expected value is $100,000 to $200,000. So, what amount of time is that application worth? If you're a small company and it's going to take you 80 hours and you maybe value your time at 50 or 100 hours, dollars per hour, 80 hours, $100 per hour, that's 8,000. Whereas the $1 million grant, 10% chance it's 100,000. So there's typically a good argument that the expected value works out, but it's definitely a lot of resources and a lot of work.
Can you walk us through how DOE funding impacts the company further?
Yeah, I think especially at the early stage, it's critical because if you have an innovative piece of technology, there are not a ton of ways to get funded. So, a lot of big companies will have research and development departments. They can fund that research with revenue from other product lines. Typically, these type of developments at the early stage, at the TRL, sub 1, 2, 3, and TRL means technology readiness level. So if you don't know, that's 1 through 9. 9 is this is a commercially available mature technology. 1 is this is basically an idea on paper. So sub 3, which is if you're below 3, you really don't have a prototype yet, is typically too high risk for venture capitalists. So you can't really get fund or get investors. Maybe you can find some angel investors that are willing to back something super high value, or you have family members or extended family that have funding, but oftentimes people don't have resources to that. So the government funding is critical at the early stage. As you go along, I think there's lots of different graphics in the industry about there are multiple valleys of death for commercializing new technology. So it's not just getting the initial funding that the Department of Energy does a really good job with to be able to manage that valley of death, but they've taken a wider view at the industry as far as where are the other valleys of death. So it's interesting. I was reading an article yesterday about sustainable aviation fuel and kind of the valley of death that it's in right now, where, again, valley of death doesn't mean that it doesn't succeed. It just means there's a risk factor for it not taking off, because you're seeing some projects be canceled and things like that. And so I think that's a really important area where the DOE's done a better job, where things like the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, where they help fund some of these high-risk, first-of-a-kind pilots, are super important to being able to help companies through these various valleys of death. So I think at most stages of the commercialization journey today, the DOE has some form of program to support companies and limit the risk to commercial investors. And that's critical to be able to bring more it's kind of, I think in some corners of the industry, they call it catalytic capital, where because the DOE is de-risking some of these things, it makes the return profile better for investors, which catalyzes more investment. So it's really critical to making the industry more effective, because we all know today fossil fuels are in most respects the cheapest way for energy and some of these chemicals to be made, but they have 100-year head start as far as refining their processes, optimizing their processes. So the government needs to put money, or typically I would think my perspective is, if you want new technologies to take over that have a sustainability benefit, that there is some need for public funding to be able to support that commercial risk that comes along to it, because it's not every company's responsibility to make less money to transition to different fuels. Sometimes they have obligations to their shareholders, which you see in different respects. So public funding is critical.
How do you collaborate with other entities and integrate these resources into projects?
I think it goes back to a little bit of some of the conversation before. So how do you integrate and how do you collaborate with the other entities? I think it's really critical to understand what your core values are, or not core capabilities are, in bringing to any sort of project that you're looking at. So this is kind of critical for any company, but understand what your resources are and what your competitive advantage is as a company, and then bring in other partners for other pieces. So as I mentioned, we recently did a proposal for a manufacturing facility. So we have never built a manufacturing facility, but we have really interesting technology that's starting to be uptaken by customers. So what we did is we brought in, number one, a consultant that has worked on a lot of these different projects. So this consultant has previous experience at General Motors in their fuel cell manufacturing division. So she's been really helpful in developing some of our manufacturing strategy. And then we brought in a really well-known EPC in the space that does lots of first factories for energy companies. So they were a critical kind of partner to de-risk some of that. We know how to build a facility of this size because power to hydrogen has never done that. So you have to understand where your gaps in your skill sets are. Another important thing to talk about with the Department of Energy under this current administration is Justice 40 energy equity. So Justice 40 is 40% of all federal benefits go to some form of disadvantaged community. Energy equity is, clean, affordable, renewable energy available to all. Those are actually really important pieces that have been newly emphasized in some of these recent funding proposals. So again, that's not a key competency of power to hydrogen today. And so we work with partners to bring that into the organization, be able to rely on other entities. So we're working with some local community colleges for some of our workforce training programs because they've got great skills in that. They've been doing that for 20 years. So again, understanding, the DOE has a rubric for the different proposals and what is going to be valued the highest. So look at those sections, don't ignore it, and think about, where your capabilities are and where you need to bring in outside talent to build a really strong project team.
What if these partnerships are outside the US?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the US funding opportunities, we typically work with all US entities. So I'm trying to think. We have recently been applying to opportunities in new countries, in new continents, and we've typically been taking an approach of establishing a subsidiary in those areas. So I'm trying to think. Typically, the partners that we work with, they may be headquartered somewhere else, but they have an office in the United States. I don't know all of the rules, but I would be surprised if the Department of Energy wants to send money outside of the US. And typically that's the same with all different federal governments. Is the project either needs to be taking place in the US or there needs to be an entity in the US that's doing the work. Again, I don't know all of the details there, but that's like a 90 to 95% case typically.
What are the challenges of staying compliant with the regulations, and how do you handle them?
And I want to go back to that last question because I thought of one more thing and then I'll address this next question. So speaking to the relationships piece and knowing some of the members of the Department of Energy and having a track record, when we are now applying for government funds in different countries right now, we have started to, number one, focus more on partners because, again, that can, back to that earlier comment about, Paul being a founder of the company and leveraging Ohio State University for that track record. Partners are critical when you're going outside of country. Find a partner that's really well known by the home country. But also, we've started to hire consultants because sometimes these grants are in different languages than we will typically write in. But they also know the funding mechanisms and the entities. So we would never probably hire any support for writing a funding proposal in the U.S., but we have done that for writing funding proposals in different countries. So that's just one thing to think about when you're looking at funding opportunities from different countries. So your question about how do you manage it? So there's very specific requirements on how you spend the funding with the Department of Energy. So I think we have a COO that's very experienced in this, and I think you'll probably share my contact information at the end. And if anyone has any specific questions, I can connect you with our COO. But one thing that we know is that I believe if you spend over $750,000 in U.S. government funding in one calendar year, you're subject to an audit. And so if you're subject to that audit, obviously it's very important to have your accounting and auditing processes very well aligned and very well understood. So the key piece you're going to have is systems within your organization for both hourly time tracking as well as material expenses to be able to code that to the project expenses, so the government grant that you've won versus non-project expenses. And so if you start to win lots of grants, this will become kind of second habit and you'll start to have multiple different project codes where you just assign everything to. But that can certainly be a new piece to organizations that have not done that. But you need to be, especially if you're going to get annually audited, you have to have this stuff pretty well aligned. And so creating expense codes and time tracking codes within your organization is an important piece. I think we've done all of that for many of our years within QuickBooks. So it's certainly manageable without fancy software. But we use time cards, whether Excel spreadsheets or whether physical time cards. And so it doesn't have to be super high tech, but you have to be well put together and well thought out to be able to manage some of those reporting requirements. That's on the budget side. The auditing, or not the auditing side, but some of the project reports, they'll typically share with you a template report for how they want to see the milestones of the project. So just work with your project monitor. Typically, whoever the grant funding agency is will assign you a project monitor that will track your progress. So just work with them to understand how they want to see the project updates. It will be in a different form than you've typically done it, but it's not in some fancy form that you don't know how to do.
What with the time frames? What happens if something gets, if something's late?
So for the monthly and quarterly reporting, what happens if something's late? I think that we haven't had too many problems with this. Typically, the reports are sometimes like 5 pages. Sometimes you just need to get it done and get your assignment in on time. However, there's certainly some grace period for being able to send in your report if there's certain things going on. So there's some level of grace period. I think if you consistently don't send technical and quarterly progress reports in on time, maybe, for future funding opportunities, that's going to be a harm against your company and your company's profile. I talked a lot about relationships. So delivering work on time is important to be able to building your company's profile within the Department of Energy. So There's certainly some grace period, but the more you don't deliver on time, the less likely you will be to get future funding. And then I would say, as far as delivering final project milestones,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think I think that, okay, so say the technology isn't working. There is certainly some ability to discuss with your project manager. This is high, at the earlier stages, this is high risk R&D. And so there are some capability to be able to adjust, maybe not hitting certain technical milestones, but getting some of the way. They know that not every project will succeed. I would say the other piece is sometimes there are opportunities for no cost extensions, which no cost extensions means you're not going to get any more budget from the Department of Energy, but they will give you extra time to be able to deliver on that funding. So those are the two options. Kind of sometimes you can rework the milestones, and other times you can get no cost extensions.
With the DOE support, how do you see the scalability of hydrogen technologies evolving?
I think they've done a nice job at hitting the different pieces of the scale-up process to date. I think that they've always done a good job on the R&D side. They're doing a nice job right now from the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations of funding some of these first-of-kind pilots. I think the hubs are a new piece for the DOE that I think is critical. One of the things that I think China has done well in the past is they are not scared to fund mega projects, but typically they have significant cost share from the private companies that are doing it as well. So you're seeing some of the largest electrolyzers in the world today be installed and the project being started in China. But with the Department of Energy hub projects that are all at least $1 billion of government funding for many of them, you're starting to see that similar model where we're de-risking these first mega installations of these projects. So I think that's a really critical piece, these hub programs for hydrogen uptake in the US. I think one of the other pieces for hydrogen uptake in the US, once you've demonstrated that these major mega projects can be built successfully, is going to be the demand side initiatives. So one of those, the most famous of those, is probably the $3 per kilogram subsidy to be able to make it more cost effective for clean hydrogen. The interesting things that we're seeing on that is if you've looked into this space, the guidance at the end of last year was pretty stringent for what was going to qualify for that tax credit, that $3 per kilogram tax credit, and maybe not be, depending on how you look at it, beneficial for the industry to scale up and as easy for the industry to scale up. But now what you've seen most recently, which will throw this into a bit of array, I think, is the recent ruling on the Chevron doctrine. I believe this was a court case in the 1980s, maybe 1984. But essentially, the Supreme Court in the US said any federal law that has any sort of ambiguity, it is up to the specific agency to determine that ambiguity. So for any sort of funding program, I think for the EPA, maybe the IRS in this perspective, if there's any ambiguity in how these tax credits are deployed, the EPA and the IRS are the ones that are able to determine that. Now it's going to be the justices. So the reason I say this is because how we determine how you win those tax credits is now going to be determined by the Supreme Court or the courts instead of the specific entity, I think the IRS for the tax credits. So not that will end up making the rules go away as far as the tax credits, but it is going to make it a longer process for us fully fleshing out what the $3 per kilogram is going to mean. So I think in the long run, it actually, because it's going to the Supreme Court, will probably make it easier to get those $3 per kilogram tax credits, but it is going to be a longer time until I think that those rules are finally proposed and finalized. So that's going to be a bit of a lag on the industry, although it might be a positive in the long run. So those are some of the different things. I think the hubs are great. The demand side is what needs to be focused on. $3 per kilogram was going to really help with that, but that might be a little bit slower to be finalized.
You mentioned being funded through the stages. If you were already funded and you're getting to another stage, what happens? Can you reapply for these funds and so on? What's the procedure?
Yeah, absolutely. So, non-dilutive funding is typically always great unless it's going to stretch your company too thin, you're taking on too many R&D projects. But so for the SBIR program, I believe there's a cap on having 500 employees. So for most venture-backed clean tech companies, they're below that. So you could have raised $100 million and still apply for a Department of Energy Small Business Innovation Research grant. So you can definitely for most programs always apply. And I think everyone should. Again, you got to think about whether you're spreading your resources too thin, but typically non-dilutive funding is going to be beneficial for your organization, your shareholders. A lot of different articles and thought in the industry talks about kind of these blended finance models of private sector, governments, customers. So I think leveraging those federal funding dollars are great and important for companies, even if you've been very successful with venture capital funding.
So one question came to mind. Does ownership structure impact this potential of funding in terms of owner being international, not being for a US citizen?
Yeah, we've seen plenty of organizations that have foreign headquarters win DOE funding as long as they have that US-based subsidiary. So, and maybe the project funds are spent in the US. So foreign ownership is not necessarily a bad thing for some of the funding. They do make you disclose, I think, if your business is owned by more than 50% venture capitalists. I don't think that's going to throw you out. We've never been 50% owned, more than 50% owned by venture capitalists, but I think it is something they like to know. I don't know exactly how they evaluate that, but you have to disclose that. One of the key pieces that you do have to be careful on is ownership from countries of, I believe, foreign risk is how they define it. There's a specific term, countries of foreign risk. I think that's it. Typically, I believe countries on that are Russia, Iran. I believe China is on the list. And there may be one or two others. But if you have ownership from significant ownership from one of those countries, a person from one of those countries or an entities from one of those countries, that can cause challenges for your grant funding. So that is something to be sure you look into. Oh, North Korea would be another. So that's definitely something to take stock of. If you do have foreign ownership, figuring out how the Department of Energy looks at that specific country. Typically EU countries, there's not much of an issue, but some of those other countries that have more trying relationships with the US can be.
We're getting most of our questions through the email. What were the biggest challenges you faced through this process?
I think that getting your track record with a specific funding entity is the biggest challenge. Once you get in and you've successfully delivered projects, it can be an easier process. It is still a lot of work to be able to write the proposals and prioritize the time to be able to do that. But once the agency knows you, your success rate will typically go up, or once you successfully deliver projects. So I think one of the toughest things is to make your name in the in the funding entity. And so I think the most important thing is if you don't have current contracts with the DOE, be creative and think about how you can leverage relationships from other partners, whether that's universities or other people that have won Department of Energy projects. Sometimes they will even have teaming partner lists associated with the grant. So you can literally look at people that are looking for partners to apply with. So that can be a really great way. Again, we're not perfect in all these things. We've struggled with Department of Defense funding. We haven't focused on it as much as we would like. But if we were really focusing on that, I would start to think about number one, who are the relationships that we currently have that have won Department of Defense funding? Okay, let's start to work with them and hopefully be maybe a subcontractor on one of the proposals. And once we're a subcontractor on one of their proposals, make sure that we're going to, sometimes the subcontractors don't have to come to the meetings with the project monitors. You want to go to every single meeting because you want to develop that relationship so that when you apply as the key contractor, that person that has already, met you through a successful delivery of a program knows you.
We have 15 more minutes. Can you discuss the role of cost-benefit analysis in your grant proposal and how you effectively present this to DOE?
Yeah, the different offices will ask for different things. So for one of our recent SBIR proposals we were doing in phase 2, they had us do a net present value calculation, as well as I think a return on investment calculation. So not necessarily specifically cost benefit, but they had specific metrics that they were looking for, what type of net present value is your proposal going to deliver once you commercialize your technology. So there are lots of resources online to be able to do that. Also, you can always leverage one thing that's great. It's not necessarily easy to, at the snap of fingers, leverage these resources, but if you are a scientist leveraging resources from universities for MBA students and things like that to help you with financial analyses can be great. Another proposal later stage that we just did had us do a lot of different analyses as far as return on assets, payback analyses, different things like that. So maybe more typical analyses that you would see for a project financial model for, like a private equity project or private equity funded project. So the analyses that they ask you to do mature as they ask for more money, as they should. And so so they'll vary based on the different funding proposal.
How do you quantify and present environmental and social impacts of your projects to DOE?
It's a good question. I think environmental, one of the key ones is CO2 emissions reduction potential, and showing that your technology has a large capability to do that. But the DOE today also focuses a lot on pollutants, specifically, pollutants from heavy-duty vehicles, from, peaking power plants, from gas power plants, so NOx and things like that, SOx. So any sort of emissions that you can reduce, I think is highly valuable to them. So think past just CO2, but all sort of emissions that may harm people. That was on the environmental side. Was there another component to the question? Oh, social. Social is definitely important right now for this current administration. Understanding what are the disadvantaged or under-resourced groups that are going to potentially financially benefit from the proposal, whether you're partnering directly with those groups, with HBCUs or tribal organizations, or whether you're creating jobs for under-resourced communities. Those are definitely always valuable things to talk about. So pollution, as far as air pollution for, typically under-resourced groups, because air pollution typically happens in those communities where they live, giving resources to under-resourced communities, and then CO2 emissions, as you would think.
How significant is advocacy and lobbying in influencing DOE?
We don't do much of that at all. I think it's much more important to go to Department of Energy events and create personal relationships with people, so you understand what they're looking for and you have people to go to speak to when you have questions. Advocacy is more important when you're trying to advocacy and lobbying. It's more important when you're potentially trying to influence what grants are actually going to be put out there. So once the grant is put out there, advocacy and lobbying really isn't going to come much into play. But if you want, so there's been a lot of advocacy and lobbying for what determines this $3 per kilogram tax credit. So if you do have the resources to be able to influence that, I think a lot of large organizations are spending resources on trying to make sure our Congress understands their desires for how these tax credits are going to be defined. But typically, lobbying efforts are expensive. So if you want to have influence in that way on what government grant projects are going to come out, I would think about joining, possibly being a member to an organization. So from my understanding, the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association, I believe that's FCHEA, does lobbying to make sure that agenda is heard. So you can join that organization and then network with leadership from them to make sure your opinions are being heard. We also have an organization called Bright that we're a part of that's based in Ohio for a lot of energy clean tech companies in the Midwest. I don't think they do specifically lobbying, but they have relationships with lots of people in government. So leveraging, a larger group that has more resources might be important if you're a small company.
What are the most valuable lessons you learned through previous funding cycles with DOE?
I think internally it's to not apply to too many things. Because if you have too many grant projects going on, you're going to spread your technical team too thin, and you're not going to have a lot of go-to-market advantage from these different disparate technologies. So it's to be restrained with what you apply for and only pick the best opportunities. And then what we've learned on the proposal is you can have the best technology, but explaining things, the DOE reviewers are very smart, but sometimes they are not experts in your technology area. And so there's genius in simplicity. So trying to explain things like you would to a 7-year-old, obviously you don't need to use simple language necessarily, but being able to explain it where a 7-year-old would understand it is going to make it easily understandable by the Department of Energy as well and the reviewers. So simplify, simplify, simplify for your proposal, I think, is one of the most important things. Don't take it for granted that people understand technical terms for your specific technology. I talked about TRL earlier. The DOE probably understands that, but you should be very careful about using acronyms because sometimes people don't understand them. E-fuels, some people only understand as electrofuels, synthetic fuels. So explaining all of those and providing context is super important.
What emerging trends do you see DOE funding in the future? What could they prioritize?
It's a good question. I mean, if you can get out in front of what the DOE is looking to fund, you can almost get out in front of the venture capital cycle, and you're in a really good spot. But I think that Fusion has gotten a lot of private funding from some large venture capital firms, but it's pretty far off. Maybe that's an area for clean energy demonstrations is one of the first Fusion projects. One of the key focuses right now is upgrading the grid. So if you have software to both bring renewable electricity projects on the grid or also help with grid congestion, I think that's a real key area of focus for the Department of Energy. Those are some areas that I would say off the top of my head. I think the Department of Energy is thinking a lot about artificial intelligence, as everyone is, and how that applies to these different programs that they're already working on. So those would probably be a few of the key things that I would look at. That's obviously not exhaustive. There's lots of new priorities, but.
Say that some of the previous projects they funded were not successful and they are similar to projects that you want to apply. Does that change their approach?
You would have to look at this specific project to really understand that. So I think one of the best examples is the first iteration of the Loan Programs Office. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, so they funded Tesla, huge success. They funded Solyndra, not as much of a success. And so you would have to look at, they made the loan potentially in 2009. If you're applying for a new solar manufacturing facility like Solyndra, what were the dynamics in 2009 and are they fundamentally different now? And if you can explain those and say there are different things that make the timing wrong for a 2009 large funding program to a solar manufacturer different than now, and now it will succeed, I think you can explain it. But certainly if you're very identical to a previous project that has failed, they're going to want to understand, why it's different this time around. Maybe for an R&D project, someone has already failed at a specific technology, so you speak to why your team is uniquely advantaged or experienced to be able to solve this technical problem. So there's certainly going to be more explaining to do if you can find an example of a past DOE project that has failed. But fortunately for the federal government, they're more able to take on risk with some of these projects. And so it's certainly not we will never do it again if it's failed in the past.
Finally, we are out of time. What's next for Power to Hydrogen with DOE funding? What new projects or expansions?
Yeah. So right now, our biggest project that we have ongoing is to demonstrate all of our manufacturing components at the gigawatt scale. So there's a certain throughput, like 100 parts per hour, that we need to be able to prove in order to be able to build our first factory. So we've been funded right now with all of our supply chain to demonstrate our certain components at that gigawatt throughput scale. And the next phase is to first, we have a project at the Port of Antwerp. So this is outside of DOE funding. So we'll be installing our first commercial scale electrolyzer. It'll be a 0.5 megawatt scale system. So the largest AEM stack to date installed. I think that's going to be in Q1 of next year. So that's really exciting. So we're validating our supply chain. We're demonstrating the technology in an industrial environment. So the next piece will be to scale up manufacturing. So we've applied for some funding for that. And that'll be our key focus, is making sure the demonstration of the technology works really well at the Port of Antwerp, and then preparing to be able to manufacture these things at scale to help decarbonize different hydrogen value chains.
Alex, thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights. It's
Thanks
been enlightening. So this was the journey of DOE funding. Once again, thank you, Alex, for all the valuable info, and to our viewers, if you enjoyed this live Q&A and want to stay updated with more important conversations, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. Your support helps us bring more exciting content your way. Until the next time, stay